This is a video analysing the way in which the original two Pokemon games taught the player how to play. Because the target market for the original Pokemon games were young children who had possibly never played a game before, the designers needed to take extreme care to make its mechanics easy to understand. This analysis was done assuming the player had never seen any of the other Pokemon products such as the anime or the card game, since the developers didn't know these things would exist when developing the game. The choice to make an RPG for young audiences is a good idea because nothing in the game requires timing or skill. As soon as the player turns on the power, they are greeted by a short animation of two Pokemon in a battle, and the title screen itself shows more Pokemon. Presumably this was done in order to show the player a variety of Pokemon from the start, in order to capture their interest since in the beginning of the game the selection of Pokemon isn't very diverse. When the player gains control of their character after selecting new game, the game places them in a room in front of a television and a SNES. The player would take this time to learn the simplistic controls. The D-pad moves and the A button interacts with objects. Technically, the player can play through the whole game without pressing B once, so learning that isn't necessary for the game, but the player will probably press it at some point to learn that it backs out of menus. If the player moves up, they will see two more objects in the room, a PC and some stairs. If the player chooses to interact with the PC, they will gain a free potion and thus learn that interacting with PCs is a good thing. When the player moves downstairs, they will see their character's mother, who tells the player what their objective is at the moment. At this point, the player has learned that interacting with both objects and people in the environment is useful for gaining information on the world and items, and will continue interacting with things. Eventually, the player runs out of options and will proceed to attempt to walk out of the town, which prompts Professor Oak to stop them and take them to his lab. This teaches the player to be careful of where they are, but that they must take risks in order to progress. Professor Oak then gives the player a choice between three Pokemon. This is actually a hidden difficulty select for the beginning of the game. However, the only information given about the Pokemon themselves is biological details rather than how their choice would affect the game. This, along with the nicknaming system, helps the player to see their Pokemon as more than a tool for battling. The rival then chooses the Pokemon with a type advantage, although this isn't relevant quite yet since they only have normal type attacks. This first battle plays a big part in teaching the player how to conduct battle without giving them instructions in text form. At this point, the player has no other Pokemon, so the Pokemon menu can only be used for looking up stats. The player cannot run from this battle since it is a trainer battle, and depending on whether they interacted with the PC at the beginning, the player can either have one or no items. In other words, the player is limited in a way that they will eventually have to choose the fight option. In the fight menu, there are only two moves, depending on the Pokemon chosen, an attacking move and a stat lowering move. The player is likely to choose both these options in order to see what they do. If the player chooses the attacking move, they will see that the meter next to the opposing Pokemon decreases, which provides a way to gauge how much HP the opponent has, and provides a goal for the player to reach. They must empty the meter. This first fight is quite easy, but the player can still fail. But even if they fail, the next battle that they win will still give enough experience points for their Pokemon to level up, which gives an instant reward to the player for succeeding in a battle, which will make them want to battle more in order to make their Pokemon stronger. When the battle ends, the rival tells the player that he will make their Pokemon stronger, and Oak tells the player to do the same. At this point, there is no objective for the player, other than to level up their Pokemon, which gives them a feeling of freedom while still restricting them to the next area, Viridian City. When they reach Viridian City, the first building the player will see is the Pokemon Center. This was placed here very deliberately since the Pokemon Center is one of the most important locations in each city. When the player moves further, they will notice the Pokemart, which is important in itself since it is also a key location in each city, but more so at this point, since this is where the player gets their next objective, which is to deliver something to Oak. This teaches the player that their adventure is not completely linear, and sometimes backtracking is necessary. A smaller building near the mart is a school that teaches the player about status effects. Eventually the player will reach an area which they cannot progress past, At this point, the player can continue west or go back to Pallet Town. When the player returns to Pallet Town, Oak gives them their overall objective for the game, which is to collect every Pokemon in the game. Now the player can get past the previously blocked off section, but if they choose to progress westward, they will reach an optional battle with a rival, who will tell the player that in order to fight the Elite Four, they will need to collect the badges from all 8 gyms. This gives the player another goal for the game, giving the player the choice for which one they want to prioritize. When the player proceeds north, the previously blocked area is now open and the player can talk to the man to receive instructions on how to catch Pokemon. Though they can figure it out themselves if they don't talk to the man, since the process isn't very complicated. At this point, the player will progress north towards Viridian Forest, which provides a different selection of Pokemon compared to what was seen previously, informing the player that Pokemon are native to different areas and can only be caught there. Upon reaching Pewter City, the player will notice a sign giving tips on training weak Pokemon. A man near the sign will tell the player about Brock's skill as a trainer. The player cannot progress any further without defeating Brock and gaining the Boulder Badge. The player can choose to explore the new city and see the museum to gain more knowledge about the world, or they can choose to only focus on battles. Either way, the game does not punish either decision. The choice of which type the first gym should be was probably a difficult decision for the designers. There are a lot of choices which all have their merits. The choice of rock is an interesting one. Since they didn't know how many players would choose each star, they probably decided to assume that exactly 1/3 of players would choose each starter. The type of the gym is interesting because it makes it so that 2/3 of players have an easy time with it, but the remaining third will have trouble. If the designers chose to make the gym normal type, for example, everyone would have exactly the same amount of difficulty no matter which starter they chose. But doing it this way around means that those 1/3 of people will have to rely on a different Pokemon to deal with the gym, rather than using their Charmander. Dealing with type advantage is a key part of Pokemon after all. At some point, everyone will have to learn it. This is probably why the designers chose to put a forest with a lot of bug-type Pokemon, so that the Charmander users would have an easy time up to Brock, but then be hit by a sudden difficulty spike, which would make them think about using different Pokemon rather than relying on their first. Squirtle and Bulbasaur users are at neutral until Brock, where they will have an easier time. This was probably done so that they would use a flying-type Pokemon to fight the bug types, so they wouldn't be too high of a level for the gym. At this point, I believe the tutorial is over, since the player knows how to battle, certain types are weak to other types, their goals, and how to achieve their goals. Comparing the remakes to the originals now, things are mostly the same, however there are a few differences that change the experience somewhat. First of all, the title screen no longer scrolls different Pokemon past the screen, making it so the player focuses on the fully evolved starter, which lessens their excitement to collect Pokemon. Upon selecting New Game, the game presents a screen of text explaining controls, which is unnecessary since the player already knew that the D-pad moved and the A button confirmed selections, since they needed to do that in order to get to the screen in the first place. And if they didn't, then they need to do that in order to do anything at all. This screen was not needed in the original and is not needed now. Then, the game tells you about what to do in the game and other things the original told the player through rewarding them rather than outright telling them what to do. It's boring at best and condescending at worst. If we assume that this version of the game was targeted at those who played the originals and newer players, then the older players who played the original already know how to play, and they are evidence that the originals didn't need this information in order to teach the new players how to play. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The remakes also start the player in the same position as the originals. However, due to the widescreen interface and the larger sprites, the PC is hidden in the corner of the screen, and the stairs take up a large section of the screen, which draws that player's eye, meaning less new players will discover that potion. A few differences I like about the remakes, however, is that now instead of their Pokédex entries, Professor Oak now tells the player a little about how difficult the Pokémon will be to raise, giving the player the information about how their choice will affect the game, but without destroying immersion by blatantly stating difficulty modes. I feel like the game didn't need to sacrifice the Pokédex entries to provide this information though, as both the difficulty information and the general information about the Pokémon can influence a player's choice. However, the unnecessary changes rear their head again, as this time in the first rival fight, Oak will tell the player about each menu in action instead of letting the player experiment and finding the information for themselves. Further along, the player gains an item called the TGTV, which sits in the key items menu so that the player can access it if they want information. This I feel is a good way of providing information to players if they need it without getting in the way of players who just want to play the game. This time the game gives Charmander a move that helps him in the battle against Brock, which sort of defeats the purpose of the rock type gym, making the players who chose Charmander consider other Pokemon. But I feel like this was a good addition since Charmander users will still have to use other Pokemon for Misty and they will have more options by then. It just levels the playing field a little for the first gym. Overall, I don't think the remakes are bad, they just front load the game with a lot of unneeded text.